Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Luen Yang to Duarte's TalkShop. So my job here is an interesting one. My job is to say things that make you want me to leave so that he can give you the real fun stuff. But I do want you to know some things about Gene before he starts. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history and a little bit of his resume and some cool things about him, and then we're going to hand it over to Gene. So let's go back in time to about 2003. I was a high school teacher in Oakland, California, and I don't know, I think I substitute taught a computer science class or something that was your class, and heard about you and met you in the halls, and you fixed my Wi-Fi or something. And so we met while both teaching in a Catholic high school in Oakland. And I didn't know it, but at the time, Gene was writing and illustrating his own graphic novel. This is 2003, right? In 2006, he published that graphic novel, American Born Chinese, with a company called First Second Books. And it won all the awards that year. It won the Eisner Award, which is the comics industry, highest prize you can get at Comic-Con. It also won the Prince Medal, and it was nominated for the National Book Award. And that was a big deal because prior to American Born Chinese, no graphic novel or comic book story of any kind had been nominated for the National Book Award. So it vaulted Gene to the world stage. He wrote a bunch of things since then, wrote and created and published a bunch of things since then. A couple of things you might have heard of. He wrote the comic for Avatar: The Last Airbender, 2012. Correct me if any of these are wrong. In 2013, he published a big graphic novel, a two-part graphic novel called Boxers and Saints. It was about the Boxer Revolution in China. And it was also nominated for a National Book Award. In 2015, if this was baseball, they would say he got called up. But he got a call from DC Comics, and they wanted him to write Superman. Now, the very first comic that Gene's mother ever bought him was, I don't know, probably in 1978 or 79, something like that. 84, okay. DC Comics presents Superman, number 57. And that was the book that made him fall in love with comics. So there's an arc there. Ever since he was a little kid, he dreamed of making comics, and one day he got the call from DC. And he's still doing it. He's still writing Superman. In fact, a new book came out this year called The New Superman, and Gene has created a Chinese Superman that has his own comic book title. It's very interesting, and it's a cool story. So that's very awesome. Gene is married to Teresa, and he has, the last time we hung out, he had 2 kids. Now he has 4, 1 son and 3 daughters. And he is a Comic-Con veteran. He goes all the time. In fact, he's appeared twice on the panel that Corey and I facilitate as our special guest. Yeah, all right. One of the coolest things I want you to know about Gene and his career is that since all the way back to 2003 and up until just recently, I think, he made all of his comics after work. He had a full-time or part-time job through all of those things he published. So he found time, he carved out time after the kids went to bed, before work, whenever he could, to publish these stories. So all of you, while you're working at Duarte and changing the world here, could be going home and creating those too. And we'd love to hear about that and support you in that journey. And some of what Gene will talk about later is what his working process looks like. So if you have specific questions about that, he would be glad to answer them. So, Gene, we gave Gene a choice when he agreed to speak here. We said, we'll pay you an honorarium of $1 million or something else, make a request. And he said, I would love some feedback on my new presentation. So he went with that option instead. And so he's been invited.
$1 million for, right? About the same.
It's very good coaching. So Gene's been invited to give a TEDx talk between 8 and 10 minutes. And he said, I'd love to try this out on you guys and get your feedback on it. I told him this is one of the most savvy, skilled speaker coaching audiences you'll ever find anywhere. And we would love to. So James, if you would help me pass out the index cards there. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited and proud to introduce Jean Luen Yang.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm so excited to be here. You know, Diana Wang, who is a former employee here, is also my sister-in-law. And she's always told me about this really magical place where she used to work that she gave up in order to marry my brother. I don't know if that was a good deal or not. But it's great to see. It's great to see what Duarte is like. This time that I have with you, I'm going to divide into two halves, as Doug said. First, I'm going to try out a talk. Thank you for being willing to listen to a first draft talk that I'm working on. And then I'm going to share with you some of my process of how I put together a graphic novel. All right? So here's my first draft talk. Now, I'm a cartoonist, which means I write and draw comic books and graphic novels for a living. Sometimes I work on stories about characters that I created myself, like in American Born Chinese. Sometimes I work on stories about characters that other people created, like in the Avatar: The Last Airbender series that I do with Dark Horse Comics. And sometimes I even work on characters that I created with other people, like in the new Superman series, which I'm currently doing with DC Comics, about the new Chinese Superman. I've been doing comics for about 20 years now, but I've only been full-time at it for about a year and a half. Before that, I used to teach high school. I was a high school teacher in Oakland. I taught at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California. I taught mostly computer science there. I did a little bit of math and a little bit of art, but mostly computer science. And when I first got to Bishop O'Dowd, I made sure on the very first day of every class to tell my students that I was also a cartoonist, because I thought that telling them that I was involved in comic books would make me cool in their eyes. I was wrong. This was the late 90s, and back then nobody was reading comics. Comic books did not have the cultural cachet that they do today. You know, back then nobody knew who Iron Man was, let alone Rocket Raccoon. So being involved in comics didn't make me cool, it just made me kind of dorky. Even worse, my students would actually use comics as a way of distracting me when things got really hard in my class. So for instance, I'd be teaching them about recursion, which is like one of the hardest topics that we cover in high school computer science. And my students would raise their hands and they'd ask, so who do you think would win in a fight, Mr. Yang, the Hulk or Superman? Very quickly I learned I had to just keep these two worlds separate. So for years, the way I lived my life was by day, I would teach high school computer science, and by night, I would work on my comic books. I tried to keep these as separate as possible. Eventually, though, these two worlds found a way of coming back together for me. A few years into my teaching career, one of my math colleagues, my colleagues in the math department, had to go on long-term leave. So my administration asked me to sub for his Algebra 2 class. I agreed to do it, but there was this problem. And the problem was that at that time, I was also serving as our school's educational technologist, which is just a fancy way of saying that it was my job to help other teachers integrate computers into their classrooms. What this meant for this Algebra 2 class was that every 2 or 3 weeks, I'd have to miss 2 or 3 sessions because I was in somebody else's classroom working on some other project. And that was terrible for my students. That's like probably the worst educational situation that you can have, right? It's bad enough to have a long-term sub, but to have a sub for your sub is the worst. To try to give some kind of consistency to my students, I started videotaping my own lectures. And I would do this, I'd put a lot of time into these videotape lectures. I'd plan them out very carefully. On the videotape, I would speak a lot slower than I would in real life. I'd even include these jazzy little special effects that I thought were pretty awesome. So for instance, my favorite was I would clap my hands and then the whiteboard behind me would magically erase. I thought it was incredibly impressive. My students disagreed. They would come up to me afterwards and they'd say, you know, Mr. Yang, we thought you were boring in person, but on video, you were just unbearable. So as a desperate second attempt, I started drawing my lectures as comics. And these I actually didn't plan very carefully at all. Normally, when I am drawing a comic that I mean for publication, I'll write a script, I'll do thumbnail sketches, I'll do all this work before I do the final art. For these lectures, I would just go in one panel after the other. I'd figure out what I wanted to say in each panel as I was working on the previous one. Every lecture came out to anywhere from 4 to 6 pages long. They were all pretty crudely drawn. I'd Xerox them, I'd hand them to my sub, and I'd ask my sub to pass them out to my students. My students loved these comics lectures. They would come up to me after I came back, and they'd ask me to do these comics lectures even when I could be there in person. It was like they preferred me as a cartoon. And this was really shocking to me. I was really surprised by this because I'd always thought that kids these days like screens, right? I thought they would prefer to take in the information as a lecture on the screen as opposed to a lecture on the page. I began talking more deeply to my students about why they liked these comic strips so much. And a few reasons emerged. Number one is, unlike their math textbook, these comic strips presented information visually. And our students are used to visual information. They're surrounded by visual information. However, unlike other narrative visual media, unlike television or film or animation, comics is a narrative visual medium that asks you to read. And because it asks you to read, comics are what I call permanent. So this is what I mean by permanent. In a comic, past, present, and future all sit side by side on a single page. And what that does is it gives the reader complete control over the rate of information flow. The rate of flow from that page into the reader's brain is in the reader's control. If they don't understand something, they can read that particular passage a little bit more slowly. If they need to, they can read a passage over and over and over again until they get it. So what I was doing when I was giving my students those comics lectures was I was giving them a remote control to the rate of information flow. And for certain students in certain subjects, that is a very powerful tool. During this time, I was also working on my master's in education degree at Cal State East Bay. This is our beautiful campus. And I was towards the tail end of my degree when I was asked to sub for this Algebra 2 class. Originally, I had planned to do my final project for this degree on something computer related, how computers could be more effectively used in the classroom. This experience in this Algebra 2 class intrigued me so much that I decided to switch my final project to something comics focused. What I did for that final project was, first, I created an online interactive version of one of those lectures that I delivered to my students on paper. You can still find this, by the way. Just Google Mr. Yang and Mosley the Alien teach factoring. And second is, I looked into how comics had been used by American educators in the past. What I found was both fascinating and tragic. So the comic book, what we think of today as comics, was first invented as a format in 1933 by these two printing press employees. Within a decade of their invention, comics had become this worldwide mass medium, with millions of copies being sold every month. And back then, in the 40s, educators got really excited about it. Some forward-thinking teachers started bringing comics into their classrooms to figure out how they could use this new medium to reach their students. The Journal of Educational Sociology even devoted an entire issue in 1944 to this topic. So they presented essay after essay of how different educators all over America had successfully used comics in their classrooms. Then this guy came along. This guy's name is Frederick Wertham. He is a child psychologist. He had a career that spanned from the 40s to the 70s. And to be honest, Dr. Wertham did a lot of good during his time on Earth. He was most well known for working with the children of these poor minority communities that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford services like his, and he would do it for free. He also did a lot of work for juvenile delinquents. Unfortunately, for comic book geeks like me, what Dr. Wortham is most well known for is a book that he published in 1954 called Seduction of the Innocent. And in Seduction of the Innocent, Dr. Wortham argues that comic books cause juvenile delinquency. And all that work that he did with these juvenile delinquents, he found that all of his patients read comic books. And he identified that as the root of their trouble. He didn't realize that back in the 40s and 50s, all kids in America were reading comics. So he wrote this book. It's dubious whether or not this book proved his point, but this book did have an incredibly widespread effect on American culture. The Congress of the United States of America decided to hold hearings to figure out whether or not Dr. Wortham was right. So they called comic book publishers, comic book artists, and comic book writers to Washington, D.C. to testify. These hearings lasted several months. They ended inconclusively, but not before doing this incredible damage to the reputation of comic books here in America. After these hearings, all respectable American educators backed away from comics. And they stayed away from comics for decades and decades and decades. In the 1970s, a few brave souls started venturing back in. And it was only very recently, like within the last 15 or 20 years, that the interest in comics among the American educational establishment has become more widespread. So nowadays, we're finally seeing teachers inviting comics back into their classrooms. We are now seeing teachers using comics with reluctant readers to instill a lifelong habit of reading. We're seeing other teachers using comics as a way of teaching visual literacy to get their students to be critical of the visual information that surrounds them. We've even found that just by including comics in a school library, that library's overall circulation actually goes up. It's not just the comics, it's everything. So even though we're actually making some progress now, in terms of using comics as an educational resource, in terms of exploiting the educational potential of comics, we're really still at the very tip of the iceberg. So I forgot this part, I'm sorry. But at the school that I used to teach, my former colleagues are actually using Art Spiegelman's mouse in a Holocaust history class. They're using Margine Satrapi's Persepolis in a sophomore English class, and they're even using my own American-born Chinese in an art class. Like I said already, in terms of exploiting the educational potential of comics, we are just at the very tip of the iceberg. There's still so much work to do. So I would end by encouraging you, by challenging you, first, to go out and read some comics. Second, if you're a teacher, try teaching with comics. Third, bring comics into your schools, into your libraries, into your homes, and let's see what we can learn. Thank you very much.
So let's go ahead and get
Okay, so I'll just share really quickly about my process that I go through to create my comic books. And I'm sure there are lots of parallels between what I do in my spare bedroom and what you all do in this fancy office. That's my guess. So every single one of my projects starts with an idea, of course. Sometimes I'll get asked, I do a lot of school visits, and I'll get asked by these kids, where do you get your ideas from? And my answer is always, it's always from my life. Even when I'm writing somebody else's character, even when I'm writing Avatar: The Last Airbender or Superman, the root of the idea is always from my life. So for instance, the very first comic that I did as an adult is called Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks. It's about a young man who gets a spaceship stuck in his nose, and he becomes friends with the alien that's driving the ship, and he learns all these deep life lessons. That is actually inspired by my own life. Now, I've never gotten a spaceship stuck in my nose, but I have had a lifelong issue with sinus problems. And the problem with sinus problems is that it's never anybody's fault. It's not like there's something sentient that's plugging up your nose. One day I thought, what if there was something sentient? And that's how that idea come from. So once I get an idea, I'll usually think about it for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. When I feel like I can see a clear beginning, middle, and end, I'll move on to the next step. And the next step is designing the characters. So here, I will sketch a character out over and over again in my sketchbook until he or she starts to solidify. So I'm sure you have all seen old Mickey Mouse cartoons or even early episodes of The Simpsons. And you know that every cartoon character, Mickey Mouse, Bart Simpson, everybody, they all go through this evolution, right? So when you're dealing with a weekly series like The Simpsons, that evolution happens so slowly and so naturally that most of your fans don't notice. Because I mostly deal in graphic novels, because I mostly work in graphic novels, most of my stories a reader will read in 1 or 2 or 3 sittings. So if my characters change, it's actually a big deal. It'll actually kick my reader out. And what I do to compensate for that is I will sketch a character until they seem like they solidify. And then I'll do what are called these model sheets. So this is something I stole from my animation friends. These are sheets that show my character usually in full body view from a few different angles, and then a few of his or her major facial expressions. And then I'll keep these taped up on my desk as I'm working on a project. After this is done, I'll do what's called a story summary. This is where I write out exactly what's going to happen in my comic book or my graphic novel. At this point, I don't really care about the beauty of language. I don't really even care about punctuation, to be honest. I'm just trying to get my ideas down, trying to make sure all of the action follows some sort of a logical progression. So for a 200 to 300 page graphic novel, this will come out anywhere from 4 to 6 pages long. Now, this right here, I feel like is the root of everything I do. You know, all of my books, this is the root. And when I first started doing comics, like when I worked on Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, I did not do this. So writers, sometimes we like to categorize ourselves in these 2 different lumps. One is like there are those of us who are planners and those of us who are pantsers. Pantsers are writers who kind of make it up by the seat of their pants. And then planners are people like what I do now. So when I started doing comics, when I was working on Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, I was definitely a pantser. I was just making it up as I went along. When I was doing that, I kept finding myself getting caught into these corners. Like I'd write my characters into these corners and I had no idea how to get them out. By planning it out, by doing this story summary, I've avoided a lot of that. What I think of is I think of this story summary as like a map. Like it gives me a bird's eye view of what my entire journey is going to be like. Right? And then usually what I'll do is after I finish this, I'll put a lot of work into this. I'll send this out to friends for feedback. But after I finish this, I will leave it on my hard drive. I'll stick it in a drawer and I won't look at it again. And I'll try not to look at it as I'm actually writing my script. So my script often looks really different from this. But just having that map there, knowing that it's somewhere on my hard drive or in my drawer, gives me the confidence to go forward. I'll know, you know, I found an ending for the story at one point. So I know I can find that ending again. Or I can find an equal or better ending. Like I said, this is like, I feel like this is the root of what I do. And there are times when I have a hard time even writing this. The reason I ignore punctuation at this point is because I don't want anything to get in the way of me just getting my ideas down. So a few years ago, I was really stuck. And I got some advice from these 2 guys right here. They're not male models. These are actually the creators of Avatar: The Last Airbender, the TV show. Have you all seen this show? Yes. You really need to see it. Like if you haven't seen it, you should feel a little bit of shame. Because this is an amazing show. This is probably the best animated series ever. So they created this animated series. It ended in 2008. And then decided to continue the story as these graphic novels. So they hired me to work on these graphic novels. And this is the latest one. When I was stuck, I talked to them about it, and I talked to them specifically about how they write these television shows. And what they do is they start all of their shows with what's called a beat sheet. Have you all heard of this? Do you guys use that here? Okay, so this is what a beat sheet looks like for them. This is actually a beat sheet for one of the episodes of The Legend of Korra. And what they do is on each of these index cards is what's called the story beat. It's one major thing that happens in their story. And then they try to get anywhere from like 7 to 9 of these little cards under each act. So these acts for a television show, this is where the commercial breaks are, right? I decided to give it a try, and that's basically how I got over my hump. So this right here is 3 beat sheets for a 3-part story that I did for the Avatar: Last Airbender series. And this was really hard. Like, I basically had to like be a monk for 3 days to get this figured out. And this is what it looked like underneath. It was just a lot of throwing beats away and trying to figure it out, trying to figure out what follows what logically. And when this is done, I'll feel comfortable moving on to the script. In comics, comics are not like screenplays. If you've ever tried writing a screenplay, you know that the entire movie industry in America, they all follow this one industry-wide format, right? Comics, there's no format like that. So in comics, if you talk to 10 different writers, you'll come up with 10 different formats. Me, I follow what's called the Dark Horse Comics script guide. Dark Horse Comics is the third largest comic book company in America. They put out a script format guide, which they just put out as a suggestion to the writers who work for them. They're not like super hardcore about it, but I found it incredibly helpful. So if you want to look at it, you can just Google Dark Horse Script Guide. When I finish my script, I'll send it out for some feedback. I have a group of 5 beta readers that I use. And the rule I follow is this. If one of them doesn't like something and I like it, I just ignore them. If 2 or 3 of them don't like something and it's something I feel kind of questionable about, then I definitely change it. If 4 or 5 of them don't like something, even if it's something I love, I'll change it. So these are all people whose taste I trust. They're not necessarily all cartoonists. One of them is my brother, who is a doctor, so he's the good Asian son. But once I get the feedback back, I will do a rewrite, and then I could do this for multiple rounds. I may get multiple rounds of feedback for that. Then I'll do what are called thumbnail sketches. These are quick sketches of what every page in the comic looks like. Here, I figure out the staging within each panel, how the characters are standing in relation to each other, where the word balloons go, how big or small every panel is. Thumbnail sketches, this is actually one of my more detailed sketches. Thumbnail sketches can look as loose as this. This is actually a thumbnail that I did for American Born Chinese. So here's what the final art looks like. And for Avatar: The Last Airbender, I don't draw this book. I only write it. It's being drawn by these Japanese artists named Guihiru. They call themselves one name, but they're actually 2 ladies, and they're freaking amazing. Let me show you how amazing they are, okay? So this is my thumbnail sketch. Here's their thumbnail sketch. Right? And this is their pencils off of their thumbnail sketch. Look at that. That's their, it's barely any difference. Anyways. So once I finish my thumbnail sketches, I'll do pencils. Nowadays, I started penciling on Bristol board. If you're an art person, you know what that is. It's like this super thick paper that a lot of art people like to use because it takes ink really well. So I started on that. But then when I was drawing on Bristol, I kept having this one experience. So I'd draw a page, I'd look at it and be like, this is like the best page anybody's ever drawn in comics ever. But then I'd put it away, and when I came back to it a couple of days later, I'd see all these mistakes that I made, right? Like a character's head would be too big. Or the thing that happened to me all the time was I drew a character that I thought was standing straight up, and they would actually be leaning to the side. It would just happen over and over again. I couldn't understand what was wrong with my brain that I couldn't see it as I was drawing it. Well, I found a solution, and the solution was if I could see the mirror image of what I was drawing, I could see like 80 to 90% of those mistakes. So when I was drawing on this Bristol board, I would actually take my page, I'd finish a panel, I'd take my page to the bathroom, look at it in the mirror, see the mistakes, and then run back to my drawing table to fix it. I eventually switched to vellum, which is a see-through paper, to save that run to the bathroom. Right? Now, if I want to see the mirror image, I just flip it over right there at my drawing table. After the pencils are done, I do my inking. When I first started, I used to ink with a bottle of ink and this sable hair brush because I read this book called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, and that's what they told me to do. And it was terrible. I was really bad at it. I kept spilling that bottle of ink all over myself. I had a special pair of pants I used to call my inking pants that had all these ink stains on it. My wife wouldn't let me wash them. She was worried it would come off on the wash. So they just never got washed. For years, literally, my inking pens never got washed. Well, I have since switched to these amazing Japanese brush pens. I get them from Kunikuniya, which is, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a Japanese bookstore. I don't even know what the brand name is because it's in Japanese. And I really just hope that that store never closes, because if they do, I am screwed. But that's what I use to ink now. And then once I ink it, I'll scan it on the computer. I'll do the lettering. I letter with a font based on my own handwriting, so it matches a little bit better with my drawing style. And it's also colored on the computer, but I generally don't do my own coloring. I usually hire a colorist. This page right here was colored by a friend of mine named Derek Kurt Kim. The reason I don't do my own coloring is just because I'm not good at it. When I color my own stuff, it always turns out terribly. So when I was first starting off in comics, I colored an ad that was supposed to go in a magazine for my comic, a small comic book magazine. A friend of mine came over, a cartoonist friend came over, I showed him the ad, and he said, "What did they do to your drawing? That's terrible." And from then on, I never tried to color any of my stuff ever again. Once this is done, all of this is sent to the publisher. It's sent in 3 files. So there's one file with all the words, one file with all of the line art, one file with all of the color. The publisher will go through copy editing, looking for mistakes both in the text and in the pictures. When they feel good about it, it gets sent to a printer in China, and the books are made and sent to the distributor. And that's the whole process. Are there any questions I can answer about any of that?
What about with Superman? What's that process like?
Okay, so with Superman, here's the key difference. Okay, so most like this comic and American Born Chinese, most of the comics where I come up with the characters, I do with a publisher called First Second Books that specializes in graphic novels. And what happens with these books is I'll usually send in the script and then the thumbnails, and then I'll get a set of notes back from the editor. And when I get these set of notes back from the editor, I'll just go through and I go, "No, he is wrong here. I'm going to ignore that one. He's wrong here. I'm going to ignore that one." And it's totally fine. With DC Comics, I get a set of notes, and the number of notes I get per page is roughly what I get for a chapter from First Second. And for each of those notes, I just have to do it. It doesn't matter if I agree or not, right? So I have tried to fight with DC about some of the stuff, and I would say I win maybe 10 to 15% of those conversations. Yeah. The other thing about DC Comics is that it's a monthly schedule. So I do 22 pages a month, and it's just really hectic because it's a monthly schedule. So it's much harder for a planner to work for DC Comics. One of my friends, who's also a comic book writer who works in both graphic novels and monthly superhero comics, he says the monthly superhero comics, you kind of have to think of it like improv. Like people just constantly throw crap at you, and you just kind of have to weave it into your story, and that's how it is. Yeah.
Just to build on that piece of it, how long, it's a monthly comic, how long does it take you to write 22 pages of script for, say, Superman?
For the first draft, so for Superman, what I'll usually do is I'll do the story summary, and then there's a step in between. I'll do what's called a page breakdown. So I'll do a 1-sentence summary of what happens on each page. And then, so from the summary can take me a few days. The page breakdown is relatively quick, maybe just a couple of hours. And then from the page breakdown to the first draft of the script, if I could get 5 pages written every 4 hours, I feel pretty good about myself. Yeah. But that's just that's just the first draft.
Sure.
Like for the most recent script that I turned into DC, from the first draft to the second, 5 pages survived. I had to rewrite 15 pages. Yeah.
But you love your job.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
So I'm not a comic pro, but the Superman and a couple others are actually seem like they're to an Asian market, and the others are just more broad. Is there a difference in story structure that appeals to an Asian culture versus a broad culture, or an American culture, or Western, or Eastern?
That's a great question. That's a great question. There are actually 3 major comic book cultures in the world. So there's us, there's America, and we've just been dominated by superheroes. Actually, we've been dominated by superheroes since the trials that I talked about earlier, right? Before that, there was actually a little bit more genre diversity. And then there's a Japanese market and a French market. And in both of those markets, there's always been genre diversity. You can find stories of practically every genre in both of those markets. So a lot of folks have talked about the differences between Japanese comics. And Japanese comics, like the way the Japanese use comics has sort of spread throughout Asia. If you look at Chinese comics and Korean comics, they draw heavily from Japanese influence. One of the big differences is pacing. So in America, the traditional way for us to put out comics is in these 20 to 24 page installments. Everything happens super fast. There's always a big fight somewhere in the middle. In Japanese comics, they're usually put out in these phone book size monthlies, and then they're collected into novel size, like novel size graphic novels. They're much smaller, they're usually black and white, they're a lot thicker. And because they're thicker, Japanese storytellers tend to spend a lot more time per moment. Like you could literally get 6 pages of 2 characters just looking at each other, in a Japanese comic. That's a real thing. That's a real thing that happens. But it's super meaningful though, right? Like at the end, you have tears in your eyes when you're done with those 6 pages. Like one theory is that in American comics traditionally, it's been about the expression of the human body as an instrument of power. That's why superheroes have always been such a big deal. Whereas in Japanese comics, it has always been about the internal life of the characters. In a Japanese comics, another thing, besides just looking at each other for 6 pages, another common thing is for a Japanese character's internal life to be so heartfelt and so strong that it actually affects the background, the way the background is drawn. Like a Japanese character might get super confused and then the background suddenly gets hazy. And just from reading the book that the background isn't actually getting hazy. That's just a reflection of her internal life. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious. I know as a kid growing up when I used to read comic books, a lot of it was primarily like Caucasian males.
Yeah.
Growing up, and for you to do something like with a new Superman that was Chinese, I'm really curious like how you were able. Is that something DC wanted? Is that something you pushed for? And
yeah.
What is that like?
Yeah.
It's incredible that you were able to make that happen.
Well, awesome. So let me say one last thing about that last question. Is that cool? Okay, so the last thing is that in the early aughts, we saw this huge influx of Japanese comics into American shores. So most people who are comic book fans, most American comic book fans under the age of 30 grew up reading either both American and Japanese comics or exclusively Japanese comics. So that like slower way of telling stories is huge now with young people. Like that's how they want even their superhero comics to be. So in terms of like American superhero comics being dominated by white males. I have to say, like DC Comics is easy to pick on, but there are these 2 points when I was a comic book fan where DC first like made me super happy and then made me super sad. One was like they debuted a Chinese American member of the Justice League in the early 2000s. And I was super happy about it. And then I found out it was the Atom. Do you know who the Atom is? The Atom is a superhero whose his superpower is to shrink. So they had an Asian dude, an Asian guy, and his superpower was to shrink. I was like, oh man. Okay, and then the second thing was they decided to debut an Asian Batgirl. Her name is Cassandra Cain. So this was also in the early 2000s. And I thought, man, that's awesome. And then I read the book, and her whole deal was that she didn't talk. She never talked. Isn't that crazy? Anyways. So representation has always been kind of a rough thing, not just for Asian Americans, but in general. For this project in particular, for the new Superman project about the Chinese Superman, that was not my idea. It was actually Jim Lee's idea. Jim Lee is a co-publisher at DC Comics. He wanted an Asian character within the Superman family, and he brought this to me. He said, what do you think about doing a Chinese Superman? And my first reaction was like, no, that sounds terrible. I do not want to do that. That's horrible. Because my parents are from, my mom was born in mainland China, and they left just as the communists were coming in. So they have, my mom's family has very specific opinions about Chinese, like the Chinese government, you know what I mean? And then my dad's family grew up in Taiwan, same thing, very specific opinions about the Chinese government right now. And Superman's supposed to be about truth, justice, and the American way. I just thought, man, there's just so many like political landmines, and I just don't want to deal with it. But then I went to the DC offices down in Burbank. Jim Lee called me in for a meeting. Jim Lee drew X-Men when I was growing up. That's how he made a name for himself. I love Jim Lee. Like, I'm a huge fanboy of Jim Lee. And we had this hour-long meeting. I don't even know what he said. I just stared at his face for like an hour. After a while, I was like, all right, I'll do it. One of the advices, the pieces of advice you get as a writer is you just run at what you're most scared of, right? So in this first storyline, the villains that the Chinese Superman is going to go after are these pro-democracy supervillains. So we'll see how that goes. I threw that out just to see, like, a lot of people think that DC is doing this Chinese Superman to pander to the Chinese market, and I was wondering about that. I was like, I'm gonna throw this idea out. Let's see what they say, right? So when I put in the word democracy in my story summary, and they're like, let's do it. I was like, okay. So you're definitely not pandering to the Chinese market then, if you're gonna let me do that. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Yes.
Along those lines, you've done a lot of original works. Can you talk a little bit about approaching somebody else's creations and working in the role of Avatar with Superman?
Yeah.
And like, what was that approach for you? How was it different? And how do you deal with some of the constraints that come up?
Yeah, I think I really like the balance between doing work in somebody else's world versus doing work in my own, right? I think having constraints around you actually helps you grow as a creator. So I like having that balance between those two kinds of projects. The work that I did in the Avatar universe was essentially like the most ideal freelance job ever. You know, the creators of Avatar: Last Airbender were still alive. I got to call them. They totally called me back. It was awesome, right? And basically every story outline that I wrote would go through them for notes, and they would give me for notes. So it's the same thing with DC, right? Those notes I had to take. But generally, because I was trying to mimic the voice of the show in these comics, those notes were super helpful to me. With DC, it's been a lot rougher. And part of the reason why it's rough is that Superman has been around so long that he's gone through several different iterations. So what Superman means is different in each person's head. And what I found when I was writing Superman was I had to figure out how to integrate all these different visions of Superman, you know, into a single book. And I don't know how well I did that. It was different.
For the writer and illustrator to be the same person, or is that common?
It depends on what part of the market you're in. In superhero comics, it's more rare. In graphic novels, it's much more common. Yeah. Yes.
So I do like draw comics outside of work, and I publish it online. So I was wondering what your take is on. There's a lot of like online comic publishing now, where a lot of people take advantage actually about the story pacing, where they can stretch it out as much as they can because everything's online.
Yeah.
Especially with Webtoon and various other.
Yeah, I'm excited about webcomics. I think the fact that you don't have a page to constrain you is really exciting. You can do some really interesting things with the form. A guy named Scott McCloud did a book called Reinventing Comics, where he talks about that, what it means to have comics existing in a space where there are no page constraints. So if you haven't read that, I would totally suggest you read that. And second is, if I were starting today, like if I was starting a comics career today, I would start with webcomics, but I would also make sure to take those webcomics and print them in some sort of physical format and take it to shows to try to sell. Like if you do that, you're not gonna sell a lot. Like you'll sell like 6, you know? But the good thing about that is by being there with a physical product, you will be able to network with other cartoonists. And that's tremendously helpful, both for your growth as a cartoonist and for business reasons. Yeah.
Any other questions? Jonathan?
The chatty one.
Well, I've been trying to write my own book, and I've been stuck at creating a voice for your character. How did you sort of, like, it's easy to do for you, like, it's easy to draw the characters themselves and do the 360 physical voice, physical with the character, but creating the voice is really hard.
Are you writing in first person or are you writing in third person?
Third person, I guess.
Okay, you're writing in third person. You're writing in third person. Is it close third or is it omniscient third?
There's a storyteller, and then you see the character.
Okay, so are you struggling with the storyteller's voice or the character's voice, or both?
Both, I guess. Like how?
Okay.
'Cause they're different, right? Each character is a character.
Uh-huh.
In your head, they have to have different voices. But when I'm just writing it right now, they all have the same voice. So how do you?
Okay, so first I would say, like fundamentally speaking, characters are defined by choices, right? Characters are defined by choices, and they're especially defined by choices that they make when they're under duress. So for each of your major characters, run through a few exercises. How would they react if their stereo got stolen? And they should have different answers to that. You know what I mean? If you have two characters with the same answer, you got to cut one of them out. And you just go through that one after the other. How do they react when their mom dies? They should have different answers. If you have two characters with the same answer, you got to cut one out or you got to change one. And just go through that one after the other. So basically, your job as an author is to be like the jerkiest god ever. You know what I mean? Like just a jerkwad god. So as jerkwad god, think of all the terrible things you can do to these characters, and just do a thought experiment. It doesn't have to do with your story at all, and come up with 5 or 6 jerkwad things that you can do to these characters. Have them react. They have to react differently for each of those. Yes. Yes, and the voice grows out of that. It doesn't matter what words they use, right? What matters is the choices they make. The words will come naturally after you figure out the choices.
All right. Anyone else? Ira hasn't asked this many questions in all the time she's been at Duarte.
Awesome. I like your sweatshirt, by the way. It's the dark force that's helping her out, the dark side.
I actually just have a comment. My friend's high school, sixth grade middle school teaches your comic.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Oh, cool.
That's awesome.
Here's my phone.
So please,
Cool.
if you see them, please thank them for me for using my comic.